In the meantime, it is also my great pleasure to introduce Dr. RAOLAT Abdulai, who is Global Clinical Lead in Immunology and Inflammation at Sanofi. And Dr. Abdulai is an inspiration in terms of her focus on digital health and integrating digital tools into the clinic and beyond. And I know she and I share a passion for chronic respiratory diseases, and she's going to be focusing on a case example around COPD. So with that, it's my great pleasure to hand off to you, Dr. Abdulai.
Thank you so much, Grace. I really appreciate the introduction, and I'm quite honored to be here today. And I thank you and the committee for inviting me today. So as Grace has told you, I am a global clinical lead at Sanofi in the immunoinflammation therapeutic area. However, I'm also a pulmonary and critical care physician who still practices, and I have training in biomedical informatics. And that's really where my interest in digital health began, and where my interest in integrating technology into clinical care really took root. In fact, back when I was practicing at the Mayo Clinic, I was using an iPad since 2011 to really show patients their x-rays and walk them through their lab results, which was quite new at that time in terms of people being able to have such access to their health records and through explaining exactly what's going on with their disease. So my presentation, again, focuses on innovation, digital innovation and technology in chronic diseases. We've gone through this disclaimer. These are my opinions and not to be attributed to my employer, Sanofi. The objective is to go through some of the technology that's been used in management of chronic diseases, as well as technology and clinical research that captures clinical trial data, and then finally go through a case study in terms of integrating, having an integrative collaborative effort at bringing together a digital tool along with a patient-reported outcome in chronic obstructive lung disease. So I'm showing you this map of COVID-19, of the COVID-19 pandemic in terms of the cases which occurred back in April 2020. I'm showing this to you because at that time, we were experiencing massive cancellations in office visits and surgeries, and we were going full sail into virtual care and also virtual trials at that time. It was a whole new world for us, and at that time, there were only 2 million or so cases worldwide. Today, it's a very different scenario, and thankfully, we do have a vaccine on the forefront. But really, the COVID-19 pandemic highlighted two things in health disparities, which have been covered so wonderfully in the last session, and then health technology. And I will walk you through more of the health technology aspect. When we think about technology in chronic disease management, we first have to take a step back and look at what are the chronic diseases that are impacting people here in the U.S. And on the left, you see quite a few of these chronic diseases, the most notably being cardiovascular diseases, respiratory diseases, as well as metabolic diseases. So there's so many other chronic diseases, such as mental health disorders, that have taken root and has been quite prominent since the pandemic hit. But there is a large chunk of the population in the United States, about 6 in 10, that suffers from chronic diseases. And chronic diseases are a huge driver in healthcare resource utilization and healthcare costs, close to $4 trillion in healthcare costs from these chronic diseases. However, technology can actually facilitate us managing these chronic diseases in a much more streamlined and also effective way if used right. So we can do disease monitoring in terms of especially monitoring diabetes, which is a great example with glucometers, with also different apps. We can also follow medication management and adherence. They're inhalers that have data on them, that have a applicator on them where you can assess whether or not the patient's actually using their inhaler. So there are many ways we can use health tech. And of course, telemedicine has been at the forefront of the health revolution in the last 1 year. In fact, the AMA found that there's been an increase of 50 to 105 times the number of patient visits via telemedicine and telehealth since the pandemic started. So this is a huge shift. And of course, there's another big shift is the Medicare payments and covering these telemedicine visits. So this has made people comfortable continuing to have a relationship with their provider and not being lost to follow up during this pandemic. But these tools must also account, these digital tools end up having to account for multiple different types of patients or personas. So for any given disease, a patient may have different comorbidities, different types of therapies they're on, and they may be in different environments. And of course, they may have social determinants of health that differ. And so we have to, the technologies that's currently being developed has to address all of these different needs of the patient, medical, personal, emotional, and functional, but also do a myriad of things, including engaging the patient, making the patient feel self-efficacious in terms of their disease management, but also providing overall improvement in communication with their providers and also accessibility. That's a lot to ask from a lot of these technologies, many of which differ in quality. And so this leads to barriers in the utilization of technology because it's so hard to navigate these tools. So their websites, their apps, their wearables, there's a myriad of technology. And so as a physician, trying to understand what is actually a high quality tool to show your patients or to have your patients use is actually difficult in itself. And there haven't been many proposals in terms of a framework for evaluating some of these digital technology. There were some researchers at Harvard who on the right side proposed a pyramid for an app evaluation. So it could be used potentially for evaluation of wearables and other tools. But again, while this is a very nice schema in terms of a framework for evaluating these digital tools, it takes a long time for a practitioner whose focus is on medicine to actually be able to understand the technology and understand these aspects of the technology. And I would say that this is no different from what happens in R&D. In biopharmaceutical R&D, we use digital tools in the development of drugs, and then during clinical trials alongside of drugs, such as with wearables. So we also have the same issue in terms of being able to assess have a good framework for assessing digital tools and whether or not it's actually capturing appropriate patient data, whether or not these tools are able to pull out unmet clinical needs. So in biopharmaceutical industry, there are quite a few emerging technologies. So there are technologies that are developed in collaboration with digital health companies and with academia, but then there's also native technology. And this technology can be can be used in the preclinical space where we can use artificial intelligence to help us find the appropriate targets for us that will be fruitful for not only the drug but also the disease. There's also, in terms of digital use, there's storage of big data in a centralized secure location, and of course using new methods such as blockchain for tracking this data. And then where I'm going to focus on is the use of the digital tools in the clinical and regulatory space, in looking for more biomarkers, digital biomarkers, specifically through wearables, and also capturing patient-reported outcomes, which we wouldn't know unless we captured it through a more a digital aspect or with newer technology. There are also digital therapeutics that are being developed specifically in the mental health space, as well as the use of real-world evidence and virtual control arms to conduct studies. So this is a very exciting space. And in fact, the digital health industry that collaborates with the biopharmaceutical industry and the clinical research industry is vast. And they really fall into a few categories. And this visualization was made by Andrea Caravas, who developed this even back in, I think, 2016, but many of these companies have actually really taken off and are still doing work in clinical trial space. So there are many different companies that are focused on the early setup and planning of clinical trials for the protocol design and review, as well as the site startup, as well as laying the groundwork for patient recruitment. And then there's another aspect, which is actually the operation of the clinical trial. Again, lots of digital companies that are focused on actually management. For instance, you have companies like Viva as well as Covance who have set up systems for you to manage not only your data, but also the documents related to the clinical trials. And then there are companies that are collecting data related to digital biomarkers. Specifically here, you can see Evidation is a company, and Actigraph. I will talk about Actigraph a little bit later on. We're focused on digital biomarker collection to allow us to be able to assess unmet patient need. And then finally, when it comes again to submissions as well as data management at the end of the trial, there are many more companies that are involved in making this system much easier and less cumbersome in clinical research, but there are many of them. And then finally, we have companies that are really taking off in terms of the virtual trials. These are companies that are focused on decentralized trials. Decentralized trials are trials that are less focused on the site, but more on being conducted where the patient is. As you know from the COVID-19, many patients were unable to come to the sites for their assessments and for their care. However, this didn't mean that the clinical trials didn't continue, and it didn't mean that they didn't get care. Many companies were able to pivot by using some of these vendors in order to deliver the clinical trial and also to deliver care. So the digital health space is large for clinical trials and for clinical research. So it can get confusing what is important and what can really help us capture the most information. But my focus for this case study will be on the digital biomarker collection. So there was a question asked in terms of how do we know if a technology is effective in capturing important endpoints? And this is why digital biomarkers can be important, in that patient-reported outcomes can be captured with some of these newer biomarkers. However, they're not the only way that we can capture patient-reported outcomes. From a traditional standpoint, we capture patient-reported outcomes either through questionnaires, mostly through questionnaires, and sometimes even through third parties. For instance, a questionnaire that is trying to assess patients' disease burden, pediatric patient disease burden, but may need to go through their parents. I hate to call parents third parties, but oftentimes the pediatric disease burden has to go through a parent or someone more knowledgeable about their symptoms. Then how can we integrate traditional and technology into clinical trials for disease management? And then who leads the way? Or can we develop a collaboration where we can develop these types of integrative patient-reported outcomes together in both with governments as well as with the biopharmaceutical industry and academia? So this leads me to exploring an unmet need in chronic pulmonary disease. So COPD is a highly prevalent disease. It was considered the third leading cause of death in the US. So I know COVID-19 pandemic in the last year has probably shifted that. It's a disease characterized by persistent limitation of air going out of the lungs, and the symptoms include cough, sputum, and shortness of breath. And patients are often debilitated. They have limitations in their activities because they're so short of breath, and they have exacerbations which leads them to the hospital. In fact, the cost of caring for COPD patients in 2020 was estimated around $50 billion. And current patient-reported outcomes don't really help us understand the disease burden due to loss of physical activity and independence in this patient population. So how can we better capture this patient data? And so we thought, well, in this example, they used an Actigraph machine to be able to combine with a patient-reported outcome. And this was done through the IMI. The IMI was originally founded in 2005 as the European technology platform to assess the ability to speed up development of drugs to increase patient access and to bring innovative medicines to areas of unmet need. And it's a public-private partnership. It includes both academia and industry and all of their multiple small and medium enterprises. But it also involves patient organizations. So patients are highly involved in the development tools in the IMI. And this is actually in the EU Charter where the IMI was created. And the IMI has had over 150 projects in the last 12 years. And again, like I said, 50% of their projects are patient partnerships. And 28 of their tools have been approved by regulators, including the one I'll talk about. So the Proactive was a tool developed for COPD patients, and the development of Proactive occurred between 2009 and 2016. And again, it was a combination of different actors, including patient organizations that were involved in this development of the Proactive. The total cost of development of this tool over the course of that time was over $15 million. But the objective was to find a method to assess physical activity in COPD patients in order to be able to address the patient disease experience and disease burden. And so first they did a creation of the concept of the patient experience. And this came from the patient groups that were involved in the development of the questionnaires. What is the experience of a patient with COPD when they're walking outside, doing activities, dressing? And some of these experiences, including very limited abilities to complete these tasks that would be simple for you or me. And they were able to take this experience, this concept map of experience, and they integrated it with a questionnaire and then added tools. And these digital tools were digital activity monitors. Up here is the Dynaport mood monitor, and down here is the Actigraph GT3 monitor. And what they were able to do was they were able to develop two patient-reported outcomes, one that's a daily outcome and one that's a clinical visit outcome, which has a recall of 7 days, that integrated both the digital tool as well as the questionnaire to provide a powerful new tool that allowed better understanding of the actual disease burden of lack of physical activity, reduced physical activity and physical functioning due to COPD. And in fact, this Proactive tool can now be used in clinical trial settings to be able to measure how well a drug for COPD, for instance, is improving the patient's symptoms. Yes, it's improving the respiratory symptoms, but is it improving the physical activity and the functional status, which is an even bigger patient disease burden? And this tool was actually adopted by the EMA Committee for Medicinal Products for Use in Humans in March 2018. So it was really a great example of how there was a collaboration between multiple actors, including patients, to develop a tool that can now be used that incorporates both the traditional questionnaire and a digital tool that can now be used in clinical trials and beyond. And so what we see from this development of the Proactive is that it is possible for us to have high quality tools that can then eventually go out and be used by researchers and clinicians. But this collaboration, the IMI's collaboration to develop the Proactive tool demonstrates a radical approach to collaboration, something that can be adopted and potentially even adapted here in the US. So thank you for that. And then one last thing before I go, I know I'm coming out of time, but today is International Women's Day, and I just wanted to just make a point that we are seeing in terms of research and in terms of R&D, a drop in the pipeline of researchers, female researchers. And for us, when we think about some of these new innovative drugs, as well as these new innovative technologies, we have to make sure that a large segment of our population is included in this development, in this thought process, and we can't lose the brain power of our female researchers and PhD graduates. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Abdulai. That was a great presentation, and you are such an expert on all these clinical tools. It's great for everyone to be able to hear the example and also present the example of the IMI as an important model for potentially collaborating across all key stakeholder groups to advance, complex disease innovation.